As I was saying before, there was this date change to our debate schedule. We now have our final debate, Tuesday, May 4th. Same people, and but the final paper for this class, it's good news. There's no exam. Aren't you happy? No final exam. Hooray. Instead of a final exam, you just have a paper that you should, spend the time that you would spend studying for the final exam, working on this paper, try to make it as good, as clear, and as, economically relevant. By that, I mean, in order to persuade the reader of something, use as many economic arguments as you can. I know you're going to be tempted to want to use maybe moral arguments and basic logic and whatever, facts and figures. You can use all of that stuff too. I'm not heartless. I will allow you to make a good old-fashioned moral argument as part of your paper. But what I'm really grading you on is, are you able to use economic concepts in some way to bolster your argument for whatever it is you're trying to persuade the reader of? The more you can do that, you have to have some of that for me to grade you on those. I grade you on the quality of those arguments. You can get an A paper in this class. It doesn't have to be really long and really whatever. You don't even have to have like a laundry list of arguments. Here's another one, another one, another one, another one. I'm really looking for the quality of your arguments, even more so than the quantity of the arguments. Okay. So good luck with that. You can always ask me if you need some help with narrowing down and deciding what should be in your paper, what shouldn't. But yeah, keep in touch. I will try to help you with that. I'm going to stop share. I think our two debaters today, I just had on the screen, Jacob and Samuel. I'm going to let's see, make you guys co-hosts. I'm assuming you have some stuff you'd like to share. So that's usually the best way to give a presentation, is to have something. Wait, isn't it Samuel? Where are you, Samuel? There you are. Make co-host. Yes. Okay, and what we were going to be talking about today was not the Green New Deal, not necessarily the biggest possible change in policy towards carbon emissions. This would be a sort of middle of the ground, perhaps big. I guess Jacob will probably tell us about what's the scope of this proposal that some people have thrown around about a cap and trade system. I am curious what the audience said. When you wrote to me in your homework, did you say you were for? Did you say you were against? What was your conclusion? I want to write this down. Can you chat to me if you're for or against? Otherwise, I'm going to have to go back and look at your homework, and it's going to take forever. Thank you. I know some people were against. I looked through and I saw some againsts. Oh, Charlotte's leaning against. Sounds like she's gettable. If you have a good argument for it, you might be able to convince her to support this argument. Philip's undecided for the first time. He's definitely gettable. Either side can get him. One. I think I got everybody. Let me tally it up. 8 people are for the proposal, only 3 are against, and only 1 undecided. That means this proposal is already, here's Nick. This proposal already has a lot of support, but you can always get more support for it. Jacob, you can always convince those people on the fence that they should be in favor of a cap and trade system? You may have to explain a little bit what a cap and trade. Are you going to explain a little bit what a cap and trade system is before you?
Yeah.
Okay, so I won't. I'm not going to now. Your explanation will be useful, I think. Nick, do you have an answer for whether you're for or against cap and trade system for reducing carbon emissions? You're not going to be pivotal. There's already a lot of people for it, but if you're there, I'm curious if you're for, against, or undecided. He's for. Okay. Yeah, that makes 9 people for it, only 3 against. Okay, so I think I should stop talking and hand the floor over to Jacob, who's going to talk to us about maybe some reasons why we should support something like a cap and trade system in order to force people to reduce their carbon emissions. They might not want to do it on their own, but the cap and trade system is designed to make it so that certain people will eliminate. Those who don't want to reduce their carbon emissions, they have to buy permits. That's what the trade is. The trading is, I'm sorry, I said I wasn't going to talk too much. Whenever you're ready, Jacob, you can have the floor.
Let me share my screen.
Nice. Where are we now?
All right.
Trivia night. Oh, nice. Recently used.
Okay. So today I will be arguing in favor of cap and trade.
Great.
And kind of taking you through what that exactly is and how it compares to other forms such as carbon tax, and just going through kind of where we are right now and the steps we need to be taking to halt the warmth of our climate. And I kind of just went through that table of contents, sort of. So where we are now, right now the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere reached record levels in 2020, hitting 417 parts per million in May. And to kind of put that into perspective and how radical of an increase that is, the last time CO2 levels reached over 400 parts was 4 million years ago in the Pliocene era, where global temperatures were 2 to 4 degrees Celsius warmer and sea levels were 10 to 25 meters higher. And as it stands right now, we are on pace for a 2.5 to 3 degrees Celsius increase in warmth. And that is kind of the line that when we talk about climate change, that's the point in which there is no return. And that is the line that kind of everyone tries to decrease from. And global net human caused emissions of CO2 would need to fall by 45% by 2030 in order not to reach that line by 2100. And recently Biden announced in a climate summit he had with the leaders worldwide that he plans to cut emissions by 50 to 52% in hopes to get to that point by 2030 so as to not have detrimental problems in years to come. And this is the makeup of all of the greenhouse gases and fuel, and it shows that carbon dioxide is far and away the most used. And yeah. So the actual cost of climate change, it's a lot more widespread than we actually think, or the average person might think. It impacts, of course, the climate and the sea levels, but it leads to downfall in our fresh water supply, ocean acidification, floods, droughts, and heat waves. They're all directly correlated. with an increase in climate. And the actual costs of dealing with such matters is extremely detrimental, and it shows that in 2100, if we actually don't meet the demands that we need, and the warmth increases to 2.5 to 3 degrees Celsius, the damages I put down below are all in the billions, with water costs being the most damaging. And this is all in regards to cleanup and in regards to combating those problems. And just since 2005, we've had $450 billion in disaster damages. And we'll see a 5 to 20% reduction in economic output by 2100 if those goals aren't met. And this brings me into carbon pricing, which is in itself is what's above cap and trade. It's just the actual pricing of carbon itself. And not only do economists believe that putting a price on greenhouse gases is an effective way to reduce emissions, they believe it's the most efficient way to do so. It was found that on average, carbon dioxide emissions fell by 2% per year over 2007 to 2017 in countries with the carbon price. And it increased by 3% in years without. And if the price of emitting greenhouse gases is expensive, it will be done for only the most economically important activities. The higher the price, the more important the activity must be. So each ton of greenhouse gas that's emitted causes real damage to the planet by destabilizing the climate. And this affects not only natural ecosystems, but causes economic costs, which are known as externalities. And those externalities should be reflected in the price, the actual price of carbon.
It's a really neat graph. Can you say a little before you go on? Oh, too late.
No, I'm here.
The graph in the bottom left, each point is a different country.
Yeah. Those that did not have carbon pricing, and those that did are the ones, the black triangles, and they're all below. Well, they all reduce their carbon emission. And,
right. Okay. That's a really neat graph. And the US probably is not on there because we have different states that had different policies, right? Okay. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. And that will bring me into the actual policy of cap and trade, and which goes as follows. Each year, the government will determine the amount of emissions that it will tolerate, and then issue permits for these emissions, which can be purchased by companies that would like to use carbon. And to do so, it would require the creation of a emission trading market, which in itself will establish a price for the permits and allow companies to bid on the amount that they want. And it creates basically its own market. This means that firms which want to create carbon emissions must pay the market price that was made for carbon. And since there are a limited number of permits available, this system guarantees the country will hit the emissions target. The quantity is fixed, while it's the price that floats throughout the market. And the certain points that are in favor of a cap and trade policy, it is counter-cyclical, and that means basically in the event of a recession where emissions might typically fall, the carbon price will usually drop, but so this makes cap and trade an automatic stabilizer in regards to if a recession were to actually happen. Whereas if it were a carbon tax, or something else, there would need to be some government forcing of the price and changing of the price, which in itself can be divisive and could have its own, political problems. And it allows for international emissions trading schemes, which is countries that can more cheaply reduce carbon emissions could sell to countries where it is more expensive. And it sets a concrete emissions limit, crucial to how the country stands right as of now. Whereas in a carbon tax, it might not be as quickly as we would like. Sure, it would be put in place probably more quickly, but it would not have the as impactful of an effect on the actual environment than a cap and trade policy would. Sorry, my cat is meowing now. So yeah. And this is kind of in discussion of which one would be better, a cap and trade policy or a carbon tax. And the biggest difference between these two lies in where the uncertainty is. With a tax, you know the price being paid to emit carbon, but you don't know the amount of emissions being produced. Whereas with a cap and trade, you know the amount of carbon that is being emitted, but you don't know the costs of those carbon emissions. But I would argue that cap and trade has the advantage of taking some certainty of the benefits that it could have. By setting the allowable quantity of emissions, which then in itself can be used to kind of estimate the actual decline in the global temperature in the global environment. But in a carbon tax, though, it is certainly more easier to administer. Just a very flat tax that countries would be willing to get behind. But if you are able to administer a cap and trade policy, it will be more effective for countries, and countries can work together with one another and have a market where they can sell their emissions from. And a carbon tax, like I said before, it's not self-adjusting like a cap and trade policy would be, whereas the government itself would have to come in and change the price if there were market forces that adjusted it. And I'd like to bring one example of a time and where cap and trade was used very successfully, and that is in regards to acid rain, which I learned about acid rain when I was in like 5th grade, and I really, have not heard that much about it since, and there's a good reason for that. Which is in 1990, they passed the Clean Air Act, which enacted a cap and trade on sulfur dioxide pollution, primarily from coal power plants. Originally, critics argued that it was not taking into account the actual workers of those coal power plants and the needs that they had, and that it would be too costly. So they came up with a cap and trade solution, which required these power plants to cut their emissions in half, but let each company decide how they want to make the cuts. They could use companies that did cut their pollution more than required, could sell extra allowances to other plants, and it created a new commodity market. And as a result, sulfur emissions went down faster than predicted, and at 1/4 of the cost. And I believe this is just a few of my sources that I've used, but yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Mhm.
Anybody have any clarifying questions they have before Jacob takes this off the screen?
I just had a quick one.
Okay.
Are the cost, you put the slide up with the cost, is that US based or is that like global based? Like the cost of climate change? I can't remember. It was one of the early slides.
US based.
Okay.
Climate change, yeah.
That's just for the US?
Yes, actually, yeah, they are, yeah. Do believe.
Thank you.
Mhm.
It's hard to estimate the cost. It's like so many, it's well, we'll talk later, but it's almost like what risks are we gonna allow ourselves to be exposed to? But thank you. Yeah, should we hand it over to Samuel? You think you're ready to go, Samuel? He says he's ready. Samuel and I, we chatted a little bit or emailed each other a little bit about how to argue against a cap and trade system. Whereas I think, I don't want to speak for you, but you said something like you do agree that we need to do something to address climate change, the climate crisis, and that could make it hard to argue against something. But I know. Hopefully, what I emailed you gave you some ideas. That
Oh yeah.
did it help?
No, it did help for sure.
Okay. Yeah.
I definitely think that there needs to be some sort of system in place, but whether it's the cap and trade system is what I'm gonna argue.
You could argue that it has to go farther than that. Maybe. I'm not sure what you're going to argue. We'll see in just a minute or two. So,
All right.
hopefully. I just don't want people to think that you're actually against the climate change action, because you emailed me to say that you weren't, and you just you had to come up with your best argument that you could, that maybe something else, we should do something else.
Hold on, I'm trying to get this. Can you see it?
We can see it. It's not in presentation mode, but we can see it.
How do I go presentation mode?
One of these. Can somebody help him? I know on mine it's F11.
Oh, I think.
Click what?
One of the top tab slides should be in there.
From current slide or from start on the left? Either one of those two green ones. Yeah.
Ooh.
That looks good.
All right. So why the cap and trade is not enough. So like we talked about, cap and trade is a system governments put a firm limit or cap on the overall level of carbon pollution from industry and reduces the cap each year after year to reach a set pollution target. As the cap decreases each year, it cuts industry's total greenhouse gas emissions to the limit set by regulation, and then forces polluters that exceed their emissions quota to buy unused quota from other companies. The government creates and distributes pollution quotas most fairly through an auction. This creates an incentive for firms to reduce their emissions and be able to sell rather than purchase pollution quotas. Under this system, the market determines the price of quotas. So this is just a little visual kind of what it's all about.
The pink is the emissions there.
Yeah. So
and the factory on the right has a much bigger pink than the one on the left. So they're giving.
So they're trading.
Yeah.
Quotas to this other company.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, cap and trade sounds good in theory. What are the issues? The first issue is many of the emissions credits are just given away Businesses have a number of ways that they can gain extra emissions credits. The goal is to create a trade mechanism so that businesses are able to mutually benefit from them. But many of the credits are simply sold at auction to the highest bidder. Sometimes these credits are just given away, creating no trade benefit at all. So the second issue is the government can retire emissions credits. Because every business has access to emissions credits, it means that the government also has access to them because they also have an economic impact on society. What makes the government different than a business when an emissions credit is received is that the credit can be canceled and removed from circulation. This means taxpayer money is used to purchase something that isn't used and could potentially slow industrial development. The third one is some credits are artificially high in price. It isn't just the government who can purchase emissions credits and not use them. Many environmental agencies have also discovered that they can purchase these credits and choose not to use them. They may not have the authority to officially retire the credits, but they can hold on to them indefinitely and create some type of result. This means when credits are traded as intended, their price may be artificially high. Number 5, it is relatively easy to cheat the system. Most industries don't have monitoring devices installed to determine how much output is really occurring. So this makes it very easy for average businesses to cheat on their emissions reports if they are so inclined. For the cap trade system to be effective, some sort of time frame monitoring must be implemented so that the enforcement can take place. Number 6, it would create a higher prices for goods and services. Renewable energy resources are still relatively new, which means they're relatively expensive. For industries that do transition into lower emissions and follow cap rules, there's a good chance that the products that they produce are going to become more expensive in the future. These higher prices get passed along to the consumers, which would increase the price of goods and services. General idea, a market-based mechanism is like a cap and trade, is likely to be a key part of America's strategy to reduce carbon dioxide emissions. What we need to do, or we need to do this soon so that a framework for emissions reductions is established. However, for at least the next decade, a market-based approach alone will not create the investments in a long-term technology needed to put the nation on track to achieve a 50 to 80% reduction in the emissions of carbon dioxide by 2050. The range of prices for CO2 being discussed will be too low to make this happen. This is just so I have it like, and I have my second bit here. Should I just wait till my second turn to do this?
So the rest you have is a rebuttal?
Yeah, I mean, just more reasons, honestly. I can just go through them.
It's up to you. If you want to say that you're done giving your presentation and want to save something for the rebuttal, you can. But it's up to you.
All right, I'll just save these for the rebuttal.
I mean, it also depends on whether Jacob has anything he wants to say as a rebuttal to what you did. We'll give him the option.
All right, let me just finish these up then. All right.
Okay.
All right. So the 7th one is it does not encourage some industries to change their behavior. One of the most significant problems with the cap and trade system is that it will encourage the industries which are most addicted to fossil fuels to continue their polluting behavior. The system makes it possible to purchase carbon credits for affordable offsets that cost less than a shift from the fuels that create greenhouse gases in the first place. There's no incentive to switch to renewables or become innovative because the required price has no impact. Um, different nations may have different standards as to what a maximum cap should be. The amount of industry which occurs in the United States is different than the total industry that occurs in South Africa, per se. Some nations create more emissions than others. This means that maximum cap will be defined differently in every society. Some may be very lenient about emissions caps and credits. Others may be very strict. The caps on this system must be rigid for them to work. It is not unusual for agencies in a cap and trade system to request extensions or additional room underneath the cap to maintain their business opportunities. The government must be firm in its enforcement of a maximum level of emissions for the system to work. If extensions are continually granted for a hefty polluter, then there's no point in having this structure in place. Continuous changes to the program that permit additional polluting will reduce the value of trade mechanism, which places this option on the road to immediate failure. Cap and trade isn't designed to hold any one company accountable. It treats every polluting facility as if it were engaged in a giant group project. If enough companies in a state reduce their emissions, the entire state gets an A, despite the slackers who didn't pull their weight. This allows the major contributors of carbon to continue their emission levels. Conclusion, the cap and trade system is the most efficient ways to reduce greenhouse gases without creating an adverse impact on the overall economy. We must have legislation in place that creates strict limits on the amount of pollution allowable in society. There must also be strict penalties in place for the agencies who choose to stay out of the compliance. The cost of doing business outside of the maximum cap must be higher than what there are for compliance for this system to work. The pros and cons of cap and trade suggest that this system is imperfect in many ways. There will always be outliers who try and get away with bending or breaking the rules. In order for this to be effective, the entire country needs to be on the same page. Otherwise, carbon consumption will continue to harm the planet. And that's it.
Okay, thank you. Does anyone have any questions for Samuel before he deletes his or stops sharing his slides? Any clarifying things? If not, maybe we'll see if Jacob has anything he wants to say. This is an optional part of the debate, but if you do have something that's just clarifying or questioning something, you have an opportunity if you like.
Sure. I'll say that right now, or as of now, the biggest criticisms that cap and trade have drawn are from actual programs that have cap and trade policy, like the European Union emissions schedule, I think it was called, which they've confronted and have dealt with criticism that talked about their weak emissions caps and volatility in the prices of the actual emissions and overly generous allocation, like you were talking about, of allowances. But those are all kind of design problems with their specific cap and trade system that they have in place, which can be improved significantly, and that can be done by emission caps can be set more strictly, and price floors and ceilings can be set to avoid the actual volatility of the price of the emissions itself. So for the biggest criticisms are usually lie in design problems and can and will most likely be improved in the future.
Okay.
Sure.
Yeah. if we do it right, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, I'm I'm an environmentalist. I would consider myself,
Hmm.
and um, I like a lot of the ideas with the cap and trade system, and reading it initially, I honestly agreed with it.
Mm.
So,
Okay.
but diving in a little deeper and looking at the actual implications of it, I think there needs to be um, just a lot more strict policies and things like that. There's too
Mhm.
much loopholes and stuff like that, or people can affect the system through
You want
lobbying.
you want more regulation, essentially, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know about you guys, but I think of this as being sort of a middle ground between a market-based approach and a full-on government regulation approach, somewhere in between. Um, Maybe a carbon tax would be the most market-based approach, and then this cap and trade is slightly less because it has a lot of government intervention and regulation and monitoring and all of the mechanisms that have to be designed by the government to achieve its goals. Cap and trade is somewhere in the middle, and then on the most government regulation would be it's simply like government taking over certain industries and like energy industries and the ways things are done. You basically you stop letting businesses decide how to produce particular things when there's a lot of carbon emissions and say, no, you actually have to do it this other way. Or maybe you give them incentives, but they're like really strong incentives to do it this way and not the other way. And you don't even bother with this sort of market approach. So I mean, what we're debating today is sort of this middle ground. Yes, there's a market involved. That's what the trade is. People can decide if they want to buy permits or sell permits. But it does still involve a lot of government regulation. It kind of sounds like, maybe Samuel wanted even more regulation, less. Some of your criticisms are about people using loopholes to get what they want instead of what us achieving what we really want, which is lower carbon emissions. And so I think that's a valid point, is that you don't want to set up a system that doesn't actually achieve the result that you want. But then again, you don't want government to become too involved in business, in how things are produced in this country. I mean, at least that's my personal opinion, is that part of the success of America the last hundreds of years is the decentralized economy, where the means of production are controlled by individuals and businesses that decide what and how to produce what they want. So I feel like there does have to be some sort of middle ground, and we're not going to necessarily agree exactly where that middle should be. Okay, I'm sorry. Did Samuel or Jacob have anything else you wanted to add, or should we go to the audience for questions and comments?
Nothing.
I'm good.
Okay, audience.
I'm good.
Did you have anything that they didn't say you wanted to give as a reason for or against cap and trade? Something maybe from your homework that you submitted when you did research for your homework?
Yeah, I did have a question. I don't know which one of them would want to answer it, but it was part of my homework why I had to be undecided was I didn't feel like cap and trade dealt with the same like carbon taxes didn't deal with like the tragedy of the commons, which is probably the number one my favorite thing I've learned in this class. Is how are you going to get everyone on board? Because there's going to be a free rider effect if one country implements cap and trade and the other ones don't have to. Like
other countries,
yeah,
saying.
like if other countries like pollution in the United States, even without a cap and trade system, has been going down, but that's more than made up for by countries like India and China. Like if you don't get everyone on board with cap and trade, to me, it would be useless, because it would just, if one person would just be off, barely offsetting the increase of another country, like increasing their pollution. So did either of you ever like think of a way to have cap and trade be implemented in a way that would get everyone on board, or like something similar to cap and trade? That's what's been bugging me when I was doing the homework for this. That's
You
why I
see
was
the chat? Nick said in the chat, well, what could we do? We could give some sort of preferential trade agreements to countries that are using a system. We don't really care that they use cap and trade, do we? We just care that they lower their carbon emissions. And each country can decide on their own how they want to lower their carbon emissions. Philip, are you familiar with the Paris Agreement?
a little bit.
I mean, it basically just says kind of what you're talking about. Every country should, on their own, figure out a way to reduce their carbon emissions by a certain amount and by a certain number of years. And the idea is that if all the countries do this because they belong to this agreement and they've committed themselves to doing it, then it will try to solve this free rider problem. Of course, all it takes is enough people to say, no, I'm not going to do it. Then it breaks apart. And you know, so what you're saying is, you know, I almost feel like that's a different question. Whether or not the US should do it, given the fact that other countries might just ignore the agreement, is a different question than, let's just assume we're going to do it. Let's assume the US is going to try to reduce its carbon emissions. Now the question is how? Should we do it with carbon tax, with the cap and trade system, with the Green New Deal, massive government stimulus to just sort of change the way we produce energy, et cetera? You see what I'm saying? There's two different questions. Should we do it? And if we're going to do it, how should we do it? And the Paris Agreement was meant to try to solve this free rider problem, but of course, I will admit it doesn't. After all, the previous president just left it on his own, basically said, we're not going to do it. And our current president said, yes, we are, we're back in it. But that shows you how easy it is to just leave the agreement whenever you feel like it. And unfortunately, maybe somebody else can think of, Nick had an idea to somehow make it in their own interest to stay. And I sort of agree with that the best way to form an international treaty or organization or an accord is to try to build incentives into it so that the countries will want to do what the treaty says. And if they don't, they're somehow, they're economically made worse off because of it. And I don't have the answer to do that, but I do think maybe it's possible, and it should be something we look into. But yeah, good point. Anybody else have any
I'd like
questions?
to kind of talk about that and tragedy of the commons in this situation with cap and trade. So the biggest problem with tragedy of the commons is that nobody owns the actual asset, which in this case is air or you know, the right to pollute the air. And a cap and trade policy is kind of a way to combat that by providing some sense of ownership of that air. So in doing so, you know, people are more likely to value their asset, the air. And that's kind of how I think cap and trade can best help the tragedy of the commons.
Yeah, but what about people in India? If the US has a cap and trade system, that doesn't mean a business in India is more likely to reduce their carbon emissions, unless India also has a system in place to reduce its carbon emissions. I think that's what Philip's point is like.
And well, but with the market that it creates, it provides more incentive to have a system so that you can trade your asset if you are creating more of it than need be.
You mean, so maybe you're thinking more internationally with the system. The system itself works more internationally.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I wasn't even thinking about that, honestly. When I assigned this debate topic, I was thinking just domestically, the United States has a cap and trade system because I guess maybe I thought it just wasn't possible
Mhm.
to get all these other countries on board where they think about all the monitoring costs too. Something Samuel said, it was like it'd be easy for places to cheat the system and just figure out when it is the monitors are going to come and lower their carbon just for that second, and then the rest of the time emit. Um, I think that's true. I did have a comment on that. Like we we already have an EPA which does inspections, and I don't think they're supposed to be. They don't tell the people when they're going to come. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. And the idea is, if you do something you're not allowed, if they find that you've been breaking the law, that you get these large fines. And the idea is the fine has to be large enough that the business will think, even if there's only a 5% chance of me getting caught, if I do get caught, it'll be really bad. Therefore, I'm going to, you see, my point is that you're never going to have perfect monitoring. Perfect monitoring just does not exist. But if you make the fines large enough, in theory, at least according to some sort of economic theory of the firm, maybe you can make it so they're worried the probability times the fine is a high enough expected cost that they actually do make the changes and do follow the rules of the cap and trade system. You would think that that is possible, even though, I understand the criticism that monitoring doesn't always work, but you just have to change the fines, the size of the fines, and the probability of being caught. Somebody has their hand up. Nick, you want to give a comment now?
Is the is the primary reason, I guess, are we assuming that the primary reason that another foreign country would not want to become involved in some sort of international cap and trade, or some sort of climate deal, be so that they could have like a competitive cost advantage in international markets? Would that be the primary reason for them to
You mean like me personally?
play as a free ride, for like them to play as a free rider in that situation?
Yeah, I guess what I think that there's too much of an incentive to the free ride for the countries, and there's equity concerns too. There's some countries who think, well, this isn't fair. You've been pumping out greenhouse gases since the Industrial Revolution, and we just started 40 years ago. Why should you get to tell us to stop now that your economy is already developed and ours isn't? And it's really hard to try to convince a country that's still developing that they need to cut their carbon emissions when the developed world, often like the Western liberal democracies of the world, are the ones they are developed and they've transitioned to cleaner technologies, and they want to tell these other countries to not do it. And it's very hard, I think, to get them on board. Now, the Paris Agreement was vague enough, I think, that it said you need to try your best to cut carbon emissions, and it was the language was soft enough that those countries were willing to do it. They wanted to do it because they realize it's a global problem and it needs to be solved globally. But with a cap and trade system that was international, the way that all of the monitoring and the costs are spread out internationally, my guess is that it wouldn't work. But I guess I don't really have a good reason. I don't really have a good reason other than like a hunch. What my best guess is. Sorry, it was a good question, but
so if that were the primary thing, I guess if preferential trade agreement was a carrot, then and if we assume that they are using this to gain like production efficiencies or like a cost advantage in the international market for whatever goods they're distributing there.
Yeah.
If you just had, even if you just had the EU and the US create a policy where if someone decides to back out of the agreement, they could institute tariffs that would be that would make them less competitive in international markets.
Someone might argue that if you're going to do all of this, the carbon tax is simpler. I could just try to get an international carbon tax and somehow enforce it. But that would be simpler than this idea of capping and trading and monitoring, I think. Carbon taxes are simpler. They're just, somebody looks and sees how much carbon did you emit the past year. You have to pay a certain amount per ton of carbon emissions, and that's it. And that would solve some of the, I think, internationalness of the problem, but it's very difficult to do. Sorry, anybody else? Or should I talk about some of my questions? I don't know. Some of my Samuel, you had a list of things, and some of the things that you listed as criticisms, I was wondering, are those really criticisms? Like, why is it bad if you said, like, one of the early ones was the trade doesn't work if the permits are just given away. Like, let's say there's an auction and the price goes all the way down to zero, and so basically people get permits for free. Is that bad? Or, like, why is that bad? Or you know,
You're asking, say it again.
I wish I could remember which number it was. It was one of your early numbers, 3 or 4 or 2. It talked about sometimes permits are just given away for free.
Okay, so
Right? That means nobody wanted to buy them. Right?
So one of them is because every business has access to emission credits, it means that the government also has access to them. Is that what you're talking about?
No, I don't think so. Later.
Businesses have a number of ways that they can gain extra emissions credits. The goal is to create a trade mechanism. Is that?
No. Maybe I'm making this up and you didn't actually have an argument that used those.
It isn't just the government who can purchase emissions credits and not.
Although, yeah, let's talk about that one. Why is that bad? Let's think about that. If there's another group who wants to buy a credit, doesn't that mean, at least for that group, it was worth it to buy the credit, and the benefit of lowering the carbon emission was worth it to them? So, economists like to think of trade surplus as being maximized, but of course, you should include the trade surplus of the group into this equation. There's some group out there who they're buying let's say a permit for $100, but for them it's worth $200. They're buying something for 100 that's worth 200 to them because according to their preferences, that's how badly they want to reduce carbon emissions. And what I would say as an economist is that's valid too. That desire to reduce carbon emissions is just as important as the desire of a company who wants the carbon emissions to produce something. Both of those are, you're talking about what's efficient. What's the efficient level of carbon production? If you have all these groups in here who want to buy carbon emissions, I think that should be included in what's considered to be efficient, the efficient level, in my opinion. I can understand how if you ignore those people's preferences, then you would see them as some sort of distortion to the market. Like they're making the market go further away from efficiency. But if you include their utility into this market, then actually it's closer to efficiency. That's okay. And like evaluating people as a group, you said something, one of your very last ones was about, I also don't think that's bad. I think it's fine. That's part of the point, is to say, well, what's the total emissions of these people? If one business is buying up all the permits and the other ones are not, that's okay. And as far as the environment is concerned, we don't care about who is emitting. We care about the total emissions. And the goal of the carbon cap and trade system is to lower the emissions. So if you set a low goal and it's achieved, even though it wasn't necessarily equal among all the members of the group, I don't see that as a bad thing. I actually see that as the system doing what it's supposed to be doing, which is allocating carbon emissions to certain groups and not to others, certain businesses, not to others. That's okay. Should say something about Jacobs. I wrote down some stuff there. You said, Jacob, you said the cap and trade system was good. It would sort of stabilize emissions as opposed to carbon taxes. It would be counter-cyclical. I agree with that. Does everyone agree why that would be? When the economy is in a recession, you don't really want to have as much carbon emissions. When it's in when the economy is booming, then that's, ooh, you really want to build a lot of stuff. But what the cap and trade system does is it makes it counter-cyclical. I'm wondering, is this more efficient? And rather than like, should it be cyclical? And in fact, in some sense, flexible. A carbon tax is more flexible because there comes a time when you really want to produce a lot of carbon, you emit a lot of carbon, you just have to pay a tax. And so I have this question about, like, who really knows the efficient level of carbon? Is it the government, or is it this information that's always present in the market? This is like a big debate, right? Who's smarter, the government or the private markets? What do you guys think about this in terms of the right amount of carbon to be emitted? Do you guys have any thoughts?
I don't know if I have an answer for that. That's kind of a
Scientists. Interesting, Tony. Yes, scientists know the right amount of carbon. But okay, so let me be more clear. There's a trade-off between carbon emission and production. Wouldn't you say? At least the cost of production. At least right now, it's more expensive to produce things with zero carbon emissions than it is to produce things with a lot of carbon emissions. That's why it's the case. So there's some trade-off between lowering the cost of producing goods and services and helping the environment. And there's got to be some way to think about what's the efficient level there. Remember the game we played with our negative externalities? If you played this game, Philip and I stuck around afterwards, and we've worked out what was the efficient level of carbon production. It turned out to be 15. On your own, when you were just allowed to choose whatever you want on your own, you went somewhere around 50 out of 100. Between 0 and 100, you guys settled near 50, but the efficient level wasn't 0, it was 15. But this is something that's maybe hard to know. And of course, in my example, it was just a mathematical question you could calculate. But in the real world, wouldn't you say it's pretty hard to know? It's hard to know. Should we put solar panels on everything? Should we, say that eliminate anything that uses fossil fuels and say it has to be produced with renewable energy? I guess it's just a really hard question to answer. And I'm going philosophically here, like who knows the best answer to this question about efficiency? Is it somehow the market, the information that's contained in everyone's individual decisions aggregated into something called a market? Or is it actually possible the government knows the best and can choose the level of the right amount of trade-off between carbon emissions and not? And I don't have a good answer for that. I do think the answer isn't always the government, I'll say that. But there are certain situations where markets that are decentralized just will never do what they're supposed to do. Then they will ignore externalities They will ignore long-term effects in favor of short-term profits. All of these issues mean we shouldn't just let markets do whatever they want. That's probably a bad idea. But on the other hand, we also shouldn't give full control to our government to say, all right, government, you control who produces what. Our economy will become centralized. That would be bad too. And it's an interesting debate. I know based on listening to what Jacob was talking about, that it sounded like one of the strengths of the cap and trade system is the government knows the right level of efficient carbon, and then it'll stabilize it there. So even if the economy goes up or down, doesn't matter, it's stabilized. And my question was, what if the government actually doesn't know the efficient level of carbon emissions, and including more flexibility into the system could be better than a stable system? I don't know. You guys have any comments?
Yeah, can I say a comment?
Sure.
I feel like it should be a mixture of both.
Okay.
Because at least in our country, in our government, politicians can be bought with donations. So I feel like obviously the fossil fuel industry and these companies that are giving out a whole bunch of CO2, they're going to be paying off the politicians like no tomorrow. And
Yeah.
and the politicians are going to say, well, this is the correct amount. And it's like 5 times the healthy limit. So, but yet again, the government can impose restrictions and they can enforce those restrictions.
Good.
That's
Interesting.
a fine balance between the two.
Yeah. Thanks for the perspective. Yeah, maybe what we really need is campaign finance reform, where all elections are publicly funded, and therefore there's no reason to care if somebody donates to you. You go to Congress and you do what you're supposed to do, and you don't even worry about getting money for your re-election campaign. Maybe that would be a good idea too. Yeah. Okay. Anybody else have any comments? I think this was a good debate. Maybe we should wrap up a bit early, unless anybody has any more comments. We've got another one Thursday. You think this was a big debate? We got another huge debate Thursday about the Green New Deal, which is really like hot off the presses. You guys know who Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is, right? She's like very famous among millennials. Or are you guys millennials, or are you Gen Zers? I don't even know. Would you consider yourself millennials? No?
In between.
You're like Gen Z mostly, right? Okay. But anyways, I know that she's very popular with people this age, and she feels very strongly that the government should get really involved with transitioning to renewable energies and getting us off fossil fuels and getting us, in ways that these nudges to the market just simply won't do, right? Even a cap and trade system isn't enough, I don't think, to get, like, let's say you have a grid, an electrical grid. If you're a business, you kind of have to use whatever power is there on the grid. Maybe you can generate your own power some other way, but there's this economy of scale built into the infrastructure of this country that is really kind of keeping us on fossil fuels and a lot of things that may be contributing to the climate crisis. And the idea of the Green New Deal is we need a massive government stimulus package to get us away from this particular type of infrastructure that encourages this particular type of stuff to a new way of doing things. Thus the New Deal. And so I want you to write about that for Thursday. I'm sorry, I don't have much more to tell you about the specifics, but hopefully maybe you guys can do just a little bit of research. I mean, of course, the people who are debating are going to research, but everybody in the class has an assignment to write. And, it'd be great if you could say a little bit about why you think the Green New Deal is a good idea or a bad idea. But we'll talk about that Thursday. And then on the next Tuesday, we'll have a debate on, is it the trade deal with Mexico and Canada? Yeah, so this is a Trump era deal. If you remember, we used to have a deal called NAFTA, and we got rid of that and replaced it with something that was similar to NAFTA, but called USMCA. And just want to have a debate of whether that's good for this country, whether it'll help America to have that deal with Mexico and Canada, or it wouldn't. Okay. Philip says something. I have moved to be more in favor of cap. Yeah, this is the part of the class where I ask if you've changed your mind and if you are more or less in favor of the cap and trade. You like the free market elements of the emissions trading. It's just trying to implement on a global scale that still gives me pause. I understand. Good points. Anybody else have a change of heart, or leaning one way and now they started leaning one way, changed their mind to the other? It's okay if you don't. I don't like the incentives of cap and trade, so I haven't changed. I understand, Charlotte. I'm just curious, do you wish that businesses would be forced to cut their emissions rather than
I thought that the cap isn't going to incentivize people to do any better than the cap. And so, there's still, and I don't think that the government will set a limit that makes it beneficial for companies to switch to cleaner energy.
Interesting. Yeah. Well, Jacob talked about this, though, that the cap would lower each year. So
yeah, but I don't think that the cost will be enough to force enough people to what we need to reduce our emissions.
Okay. You don't believe that it would be strong enough.
Yes.
You know what no one talked about? Whether it would pass. Whether Congress would ever pass something like this. I'm a little skeptical that we have one of our two parties would insist that this does not pass. And because unless it's the party that is technically a minority party in both houses of Congress, but still wields a lot of power, especially because of the filibuster. Okay, so that's another issue. Even if everybody in this class agrees we should have a cap and trade system, if it doesn't get to be passed through Congress, it's just not going to work.
I feel
okay. Oh, sorry.
I feel like if the Congress composition was like that of 2009, I feel like it would pass.
Possibly.
Because the Democrats would have a supermajority of 60, and that's filibuster proof.
Yeah. Interesting. Okay, guys.